On a quiet evening in a small town, 9-year-old Sarah Miller sat at her tiny wooden desk, clutching a worn-out crayon in one hand and her beloved teddy bear, Mr. Fuzzy, in the other. The flickering lamp cast a warm glow on her paper as she carefully wrote each word, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration. She had never written a letter to anyone important before, let alone to the President of the United States. But tonight, she had a question that had been weighing on her heart for as long as she could remember. Does God really listen to kids' prayers? Sarah's world was small but filled with big worries. Her mother, Jessica Miller, worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on and food on the table. Their tiny apartment wasn't much, but it was filled with love. Every night, Sarah watched her mom sit at the kitchen table, sorting through bills with tired eyes, sighing heavily as she tried to make sense of numbers that never seemed to add up. Sarah prayed every night, prayed that her mom wouldn't have to work so hard, that maybe her dad, who had left years ago, would come back. She prayed for warm food, for Christmas presents, for a miracle that never seemed to arrive. And after months of waiting, doubt had crept in. Did God even hear her? Then, one evening, Sarah heard something on TV that made her sit up straight. President Donald Trump stood behind a podium, addressing the country. His voice was firm, powerful, but something in the way he spoke about faith and the power of prayer struck a chord in Sarah's young heart. "He talks about God a lot," she whispered to Mr. Fuzzy. Maybe he knows the answer." And just like that, Sarah grabbed a piece of paper, determined to ask the biggest question of her life. "Dear President Trump," she wrote in uneven but careful handwriting. "My name is Sarah Miller. I am 9 years old. I love my mom a lot, and I pray every night for her. But sometimes it feels like God doesn't listen. Can you tell me if he hears kids' prayers? I really want to know. Also, my teddy bear has a loose eye, but Mom says it makes him special. Do you think things that aren't perfect can still be important?" She finished the letter with a small drawing at the bottom, her and her mom standing under a big, bright sun. As she sealed the envelope, Sarah turned to her mother with wide, hopeful eyes. "Mom, do you think he'll answer me?" Jessica hesitated. She wanted to prepare Sarah for disappointment. The president gets thousands of letters every day. But looking at her daughter's unwavering faith, she couldn't bring herself to crush it. "We can send it," Jessica said gently. "And we'll just have to wait and see." Sarah grinned, hugging Mr. Fuzzy tight. But what she didn't know was that her simple crayon letter was about to start something extraordinary, something that would reach beyond her small town and into the highest office in the land. And when President Trump finally read her words, his response would shake the entire nation. Days turned into weeks. Every morning, Sarah would rush to the mailbox, standing on her tiptoes as she eagerly pulled open the metal door, only to find nothing but bills and flyers. Her mother watched as her excitement slowly faded, replaced by uncertainty. Maybe the president would never see her letter. Maybe Tommy Wilson, the class bully, was right when he said, "The president doesn't have time for kids' silly letters." But then, everything changed. It was a normal afternoon when Jessica arrived home from her shift at the diner, tossing her purse onto the kitchen counter and kicking off her worn-out shoes. She was just about to call Sarah for dinner when the phone rang. A voice on the other end introduced herself. "Hello, this is Angela Morrison from the White House. Is this Jessica Miller?" Jessica's breath caught in her throat. "Yes, this is she," she answered cautiously. "I'm calling on behalf of President Donald Trump. He read your daughter Sarah's letter, and it deeply touched him. The president would like to personally invite Sarah and you to the White House for a special meeting." Jessica's knees nearly gave out. "The White House?" she whispered. "Yes, ma'am." The president was particularly moved by Sarah's questions about faith, and he would like to speak with her in person. We would love to arrange for your travel and accommodations as soon as possible. Jessica pressed a hand over her mouth, trying to contain her emotions. This wasn't real, was it? She turned to see Sarah standing in the doorway, wide-eyed, clutching Mr. Fuzzy in her small arms. "Mom?" Sarah asked softly, sensing something big was happening. Jessica lowered the phone slightly and took a deep breath. "Honey," she said, her voice shaking. "The president. He read your letter, and he wants to meet you." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Sarah's blue eyes sparkled with disbelief before filling with happy tears. "Really?" she gasped. Jessica nodded, barely holding back her own tears. Sarah let out a squeal and hugged Mr. Fuzzy so tight that his loose button eye nearly popped off again. From that moment, everything became a blur of preparation. The White House arranged flights, security clearances, and accommodations for Sarah and her mother. The local news picked up the story, and soon everyone in their small town knew about the little girl whose crayon letter had reached the President of the United States. Even Tommy Wilson, the same boy who had laughed at Sarah's letter, stood in stunned silence when their teacher, Miss Thompson, announced the news in class. "You're going to meet the President?" Tommy asked, his voice quieter than usual. Sarah nodded proudly. Miss Thompson smiled warmly. "This is a lesson for all of us," she said. "When you believe in something, don't be afraid to ask big questions." Sometimes the world listens. That night, Sarah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, clutching Mr. Fuzzy close. "Mom," she whispered in the dark. "Yes, sweetheart," Jessica replied from the doorway. "What if the president doesn't have the answers?" Sarah's voice was small, uncertain. Jessica walked over and gently brushed a strand of hair from Sarah's face. "Then we'll listen to what he says," she answered. "And no matter what, you should be proud. You wrote from your heart, and it reached the highest office in the country. That's something no one can ever take away from you." Sarah nodded, feeling a sense of peace and excitement swell in her chest. Tomorrow, she would pack her bags. In just 2 days, she would step inside the White House. And in just 3 days, she would come face to face with President Donald Trump himself. But what he would tell her next, no one could have predicted. The sun shone brightly over Washington, D.C., reflecting off the white columns of the White House as Sarah and her mother stepped out of the car. Sarah clutched Mr. Fuzzy tightly in her arms, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. A uniformed officer greeted them at the entrance, smiling warmly. "Welcome to the White House, Miss Sarah." Sarah swallowed hard. She wasn't just Sarah from Lincoln Elementary School anymore. She was Sarah Miller, the little girl whose letter had reached the president. As they were led inside, the hallways stretched endlessly, decorated with portraits of past leaders. The grandeur of the place was overwhelming, but Sarah kept her focus on one thing, her question. Does God really listen to children's prayers? A White House staff member, Miss Parker, led them into a bright and elegant meeting room. "President Trump will be with you shortly," she said with a reassuring smile. Sarah sat on a plush chair, gripping Mr. Fuzzy so tightly that she could feel his loose button eye pressing into her palm. "What if I forget what to say?" she thought. Before she could dwell on it, the doors opened, and President Donald Trump stepped inside. Sarah's breath hitched. He was exactly as she had seen him on TV, but something about this moment felt different. He wasn't behind a podium, speaking to a crowd. He was here, standing just a few feet away, looking directly at her. "Sarah," the president said warmly, "it's an honor to meet you." Sarah stood up quickly, her tiny hands shaking, but she remembered her manners just in time. "It's nice to meet you too, sir." she said, her voice small but steady. The president chuckled, noticing Mr. Fuzzy in her arms. "And who's this?" Sarah glanced at her bear, then back at the president. "This is Mr. Fuzzy," she said. "He's been with me for a long time. My mom fixed his eye when it almost fell off." The president knelt down to her level, eyeing the bear with interest. "Well, that loose button tells a story, doesn't it? It shows that even when things get worn, they can still be fixed. Sometimes the things that aren't perfect are the most special of all." Sarah's grip on Mr. Fuzzy tightened. It was exactly what she needed to hear. The president motioned for her to sit, and he took a chair beside her. "I read your letter," he said. "And I have to tell you, it was one of the most powerful letters I've ever received." Sarah's eyes widened. She took a deep breath. This was her moment. "Sir," she began, her voice gaining confidence, "I wanted to ask you something important. I pray every night for things to get better, but sometimes it feels like nothing changes. Does God really listen to kids like me?" The room fell silent. Even the advisors and staff members who stood quietly in the background seemed to hold their breath. President Trump was quiet for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. Then he looked Sarah right in the eye and said, "Sarah, let me tell you something that I've learned in my life. God hears every prayer. But sometimes the answer doesn't come the way we expect." Sarah tilted her head. "What do you mean?" The president leaned forward. "Sometimes God doesn't give us what we ask for right away. Instead, he gives us the strength to keep believing, even when things are hard. And sometimes he uses people, even little girls like you, to be the answer to someone else's prayers." Sarah's heart swelled. The president continued, "Your mother, for example, she prays every night that she can take care of you. And you prayed for something to change. And guess what? You wrote a letter. That letter made it all the way here. And now people are listening." Sarah blinked back tears. Her letter, the one she wrote in crayon, had done that? The president turned to Sarah's mom. "Mrs. Miller, I want you to know that your daughter's words have inspired us. Because of her, we are launching a new initiative to help families like yours, families who work hard but still struggle. And we're going to make sure that no parent has to work 3 jobs just to keep the lights on." Jessica gasped, covering her mouth. "You mean," she whispered, "you're really going to help?" The president nodded. "We're starting something today, right now, that will help families across America." And it all started with Sarah's letter. Sarah couldn't believe it. Her hands trembled as she looked down at Mr. Fuzzy, whose loose button eye seemed to wink back at her. God really was listening. The president smiled warmly. "Sarah, your faith is stronger than most adults, I know. And I want you to remember this: never stop believing that your voice matters." Sarah nodded, her chest feeling light, like 1,000 prayers had just been answered all at once. Before they left, the president handed Sarah a small box. Inside was a brand new button for Mr. Fuzzy. "It's for his eye," the president said, "but only if you want to replace it. Sometimes the things that seem broken are exactly as they should be." Sarah looked at the button, then at Mr. Fuzzy's worn out but beloved eye. She smiled softly. "No, sir," she said. "I think Mr. Fuzzy's eye is perfect just the way it is." The president chuckled. "That's a wise choice, young lady." As Sarah and her mother left the White House, tears of joy filled their eyes. Her prayer had been answered. Not in the way she expected, but in a way she never could have imagined. And as the news of her letter spread across the country, millions of people heard the story of the little girl who dared to ask a big question and got an answer that changed everything. Do you believe that faith can move mountains? Comment below and share your thoughts. And if you want more inspiring stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Sometimes all it takes is a single letter to change the world.